This podcast is part of the Deluxe Edition Network. To find other great shows on the network, head over to deluxeeditionnetwork.com. That's deluxeeditionnetwork.com.
The year is 1985, and it was 9 years since the world had seen a Western starring Clint Eastwood. The film Pale Rider. When property owner Coy LaHood starts using a band of hooligans to terrorize a group of small-town miners into giving up their territory, an enigmatic man named the Preacher arrives into town. The Preacher fends off attacks and then goes directly to LaHood to negotiate. When the miners, led by Hull Barret, refuse the terms, LaHood sends in Marshall Stockburn to take down the Preacher and the others. In what may not seem like the most original Western ever, it was the Western that kicked off the craze of the 80s and reignited Clint Eastwood's love for the genre. Tonight on Back to the Balcony, we discuss Pale Rider. Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, two titans of cinematic review. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but always captivating. Your hosts Antonio of the Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast and Justin Henson of the Movie Wire are here to take you back to the balcony. Okay, so is Pale Rider a movie that I am super well versed in? Absolutely not. But we've discussed on this podcast and on other podcasts about my love-hate relationship with Clint Eastwood directed projects. And my parents were huge fans of Clint Eastwood. So when my dad passed away, he passed along his Clint Eastwood collection of DVDs to me. So I've slowly been working my way through the 80s ones. And there's a lot of ones that I like. I do like some of his war dramas and his crime dramas. I like all the Dirty Harrys. But for me, if it wasn't a Leone Western, and if it wasn't Unforgiven, I never really was too interested in the Clint Eastwood Westerns of the 80s. So I thought that I would take a chance on this one because it was on my shelf. I hadn't seen it in decades, just to see if it held up. Because I did see this in the theater, but it was so uninteresting to me at the age of 5 that it didn't really even stick. And I don't think I ever watched it on TV with my parents. I remembered certain moments. But I did watch the review, and I wanted to see which of our critics I sided with. And we're going to give it up really quickly. But before I give my opinion, what is your history, and what is your view on Pale Rider?
So I'm kind of with you. Like growing up, I think it must have been that generation because I grew up in a home where my dad loved Westerns. He loved Clint Eastwood. Same with my grandparents. And as a kid, there is no appeal to me when it comes to Western. And last episode, I said I'm really particular with period pieces and Westerns. And I still am to this day because I didn't really start getting into Westerns until I took a film lit class. And I saw High Noon with Gary Cooper. And that was the first time a teacher gave me the aha moment of really looking at the symbolic underlays of a Western, if it's a good Western.
Right.
And watching Pale Rider, I saw this probably about 6 months into that class. And it reminded me a lot of High Noon. It has a lot of the symbolic surface and it has a lot of the symbolic undertones. And it's enough here to stay true to the genre and really appease me when I'm looking critically at a film to entertain me. And I, like you said, there's going to be a critic I thought I was going to be on board with when it comes to it. But if it was me 30 years ago, absolutely, I would side with this one critic. But today, I'm siding with the other critic, and we'll get into it. But this one I really did enjoy because it follows the tropes of a normal Western, but there's a lot more depth to it that I really can appreciate now.
It's not a bad movie. I will definitely say that it's not a bad movie. 7.3 on IMDb, 93% on Rotten Tomatoes. That's almost equal to Unforgiven, which to me is Clint Eastwood's quintessential Western that he directed himself. I mean, that's the movie that really kicked off the Western craze, where it wasn't afraid to be dark. It wasn't afraid to be a little dirty and grungy, where this still has a little bit of that Western fantasy of the old days, right? And I don't mind that. I like it a lot. The biggest issue for me that, again, I didn't recognize when I was younger, but I recognize now because I've seen way too many goddamn movies, is this is Shane. This is really just Shane. It's like almost page for page, it's Shane with High Plains Drifter, which is another Eastwood movie where it's got like a supernatural tone, metaphysical, so to speak, of is this guy a spirit? Is this guy a myth? Is this guy a legend? Like, what is this guy? There has to be some kind of mysteriousness to him, where like not like the Man with No Name trilogy where he was just a badass outlaw with no name, so the law couldn't catch him. Like, that was cool. No, this is definitely him playing on the tropes that he'd already done, but it's Shane, you know? This mysterious stranger comes into town, protects villagers and miners from the evil, you know, landowners and capitalists and stuff like that. That doesn't mean that it's bad. It just, to me, it didn't seem original enough of a story. And there were a few little, I don't know, Eastwood tropes that I think he was still having to get rid of from his 70s and 80s that are a little bit silly before he took himself a little bit more serious as a director. And I'm going to say even as an actor, while directing himself in the films that we would see later on. But it's not a bad movie. I was very pleasantly surprised on this rewatch. Let's start technical, right? It's gorgeous. It's a gorgeous movie. And it only had a $7 million budget. Studios didn't want this. They thought Westerns were over. Like, we're still in the world where Heaven's Gate killed the idea of a modern Western, right? You had Silverado and a few that tried to get in there, but people weren't really excited for Westerns yet. But you put Clint Eastwood in a Western in the 80s because people were missing that. And yeah, I get why some of our critics were excited to see it because it was perhaps the movie that would bring the genre back. And I can see that. But again, technically wise, it's beautiful. The music is beautiful. The art design, the set design, everything is exactly the way it should be. Why does it bother me sometimes, though, that I feel like it's trying to be a little too modern and a little too safe? That was my biggest takeaway. I didn't feel like there was enough danger in the movie. What was your thought?
So you're absolutely right on the technical aspects. I mean, Joel Cox's editing on this was to a T. Within the first 5 minutes, you know this is going to have good editing with that big raid in the village. So
the
Joel
editing
Cox,
is fantastic.
It's fantastic. Joel Cox did a fantastic job. When it comes to Ernie Bishop's set design, you get a lot of detail here from the barbershop / dentist. That I love that little tidbit in there. But you can also tell the low budget right from the beginning as well. When that dog gets shot, and then Megan picks it up, and it's obviously a stiff doll that the camera missed. So there's a lot of technical aspects that are really good, but it does show some sloppiness to it. When it comes to the traditional piece of it, I think this is where it was a tug of war between Eastwood and the studios, where they wanted to have that traditional Western, but there wanted to be something more because our writers here, they're not experienced Western writers. They know Rambo. They went at this with Rambo in the West. That's what it is. And they added some depth to it. But here's where the depth comes into play is that it's not a traditional. If you look at Westerns, you have the black and white hats, one to symbolize good, one to symbolize bad. Here you have Eastwood with a black hat. And again, you have those religious undertones that are really going to separate this from what you see in other Westerns, right? So we'll get more into depth in that because we can go on a rant on that. But here is where it separates itself on Eastwood's direction is that he is brilliant in this because he doesn't make that up front and center. He keeps the mystery going on whether this is a myth or a legend. This could be either one of those when it comes to storytelling, when it comes to the style of it, because he puts it in his camera shots with Eastwood leaving and entering the shot with no explanations, the names of the characters. So there's a lot of things here that really add a question mark to keep the viewer attached to where this is going to go. So to me, this is one of his best directed, not best movies in my opinion, but best directed movies of his, because there is a lot of attention to detail when it comes to his direction here.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And There has to be, like you said, a modern day formula to get audiences more involved and attached to the story, because I think one of the things that our critics do have a good point on is so many of the Western tropes were done to death. Like I said, this is a Shane / High Plains Drifter. I hate saying ripoff, but I don't want to say an homage because it's just too on the nose. But I mean, it's a formula that works. It's a story that works. It's a perfect setup for a Western like this, or a samurai film. It really could be either. I think that people had seen too many of those stories, and when they tried to make a Western into an art form like they did in Heaven's Gate, Michael Cimino had a vision. I like Heaven's Gate, but it's not what people were expecting, and that's why it really, really killed that genre, especially going so over budget. So having to work with a $7 million budget and a lot of technical challenges with that dollar amount, you can see where they have to be really safe in where they're setting their action pieces, on where they're setting their more dramatic pieces. They're by the riverbed, or in a cabin, or in the town where there's literally no residents except for the shopkeeper, his wife, and the barber. Like, that's it. That's the town, is those three people. So when people from the mine say, I want to go to town, sounds like fun. I'm like, really? There's like 3 people that live there, and they're all in the shop. I digress. But that's okay, because I think Eastwood does a good enough job keeping the pacing and the energy and the dramatics going that you forgive the little inadequacies that the film has. And it's so well shot and so well edited and so well scored. And one thing that I appreciated with this film that I think that even Unforgiven doesn't do that well is that it has a great balance of action and drama all the way throughout, where just when you feel like it's getting a little too sluggish with the storytelling, someone shows up and starts shooting. Or there's, the action scene with Richard Kiel, which love seeing him in a movie, right? It's like an hour and 40 minutes, kind of long, but at the same time, didn't feel it. I felt like it was a very solid paced and energetic movie.
Yeah, 100%. And you mentioned the town. I actually enjoyed this town because it actually does take me away to almost a fantasy. And to me, it makes sense because you have these villains, these antagonists living in this town. On who wants to live in this town other than the ones that already own a shop to make a living?
They're like running it.
Yeah, but to me, I love the fact that they have these 2 separate settings to it, where it's a simplistic setting when you go into town, but there's an added danger because of the people, not the set, not the town. Because to me, that would be stereotypical if you have this town that is just the roaring town that has a lot of activity. You have the bar fight, you have the poker game that goes wrong. There's a lot of elements and temptation when you have a busy town where you have added conflicts. This movie doesn't need added conflicts. It sticks to simplicity, and that's where the symbolic nature comes in, that's what it uses to drive the audience to really fall for this movie in a positive way to an extent. But this is a time where I think this was a wrong time and place for this movie for symbolic natures or religious factors going into a Western, because this was the 80s. This is where a lot of the Brat Pack teenage movies came in, and this was targeted toward those Western lovers. And this isn't going to when you're trying to reinvent a genre, you need to target the younger audience, and that wasn't this. This was the wrong way. But to me, this is how reboots or remakes should be, is taking a simplistic storyline and adding some depth to it. And that's what I can appreciate about Eastwood, what he's trying to do here, and our writers. But I think this was absolutely the wrong time and place for that kind of experiment with Westerns, because it didn't attach to the audience of what it was targeted for.
And when we get to the reviews of our critics, that definitely comes into play, and I'll have a lot to say about it, because I was spending the last several days trying to pick apart my feelings on this, because like I said, it's not a bad movie. I like this movie, but it doesn't blow me away. But again, I don't need to be blown away by a movie. I've said that so many times on this show, where if you go into a film expecting it to blow you away and knock your socks off, well, you're just setting yourself up for a disappointment. Just let the movie take you where it's trying to take you. And this movie does that. So let's talk about the cast now, because this is one of the things about this movie that, like, again, it's a problem for me. Eastwood, fantastic. Carrie Snodgrass, one of my favorites. Michael Moriarty, I've never been a fan. Never been a fan. The Stuff and Q, the winged serpent. I mean, he's definitely a B-movie actor, and he brings B-movie energy to this. But again, he is supposed to be kind of cowardly. It is the right kind of guy to play this role, but I just am never convinced by him. Now, Sydney Penny as Megan, who is essentially like the little boy character in Shane, the one that falls in a fascination and, in this version, kind of a romantic love or at least obsession with our title character, the Pale Rider, Clint Eastwood, the preacher. I don't not like her performance, but I'm also thinking that there could have been better choices, but it doesn't hurt the movie enough where she plays it very mellow and almost underplayed. I have to admit, I'd rather have that than someone who was over dramatic or melodramatic, right? It could be a very easy role to go that far with, especially with the female actresses of her age range in the 80s. There was a lot of people that just brought a lot of energy to movies that didn't need that much energy. So I might be a little bit harsh on her, but I think that her underplaying that part definitely benefits the movie more than hurts it. And then my last little two pieces is Richard Dysart is just a great character actor, great villain, and I think he should have had a lot more screen time and opportunity to be more villainous because he's so good. He's so good in everything, and he just didn't have enough screen time. And the same thing could be said for the Marshal. He comes in really late in the movie, and that's fine. Like, his whole point is he brings his deputies, it's almost like a hit squad, to take out the miners, and he has a past with the preacher. So I like how they left that a little ambiguous, that we really don't know what their past is. All we know is that they have a past, and the Marshal assumes that he's dead. So that brings a supernatural aspect to it. But what a chiseled face and tall, slim figure to match Eastwood in that final moment, in those final shootout scenes. I wanted 20 more minutes of that. Like, I think that's one of the things about this movie is the things that I really liked, it didn't give me enough of, and I wanted more. And the things that I didn't want, it perhaps gave me a little too much of.
Yeah, when it comes to the Marshal, I love that you brought that up because early in the scene, and this is kind of the mystery that I love about this, and I'm going to get into the cast here, is the fact that in the beginning, we see Clint Eastwood take his shirt off. He has, 6 bullet holes in his back. That's the entry level of the mystery. Then at the end, we get that final scene with the Marshal of it's you. And they obviously know each other. And this is where that religious aspect comes in, where it kind of starts to have the audience connect the dots of this man, Clint Eastwood, came back for redemption. He wears the colors of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse throughout the movie. So everything points to these two knowing each other, and he's coming back for revenge. Just that single line of it's you really kind of pulls this story together. And a lot of this cast, we can tell going into it, is all low budget because this is a cast that just screams quantity, not quality in their careers. And with the exception of young Chris Penn. But these are all cast members that really did go the horror route or go to the low budget B movie route in their careers. And we can kind of see that in the subtlety of their performances when it comes to it, especially with Megan during that one scene, which is, I think, a very great scene that our critics are going to speak to because there's a lot of depth to that on the underlayers of it. But when it comes to my favorite performance of it, I think Clint Eastwood does a great job, but I think Richard Hamilton, again, not enough screen time. This man, I think, stopped aging after this movie, and he looks exactly the same, but does a fantastic job with Fran Ryan as Ma. I mean, these two are the likability to it. And anytime they would come on screen, I would smile because I just enjoyed their screen presence and their chemistry when they interact with the customers, especially when we get the first introduction with Hull in the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, they are bringing that classic Western energy to this. So there are a lot of throwback character actors in this film that go back to the old days Westerns, TV movie Westerns. We've got 2 cast members from John Carpenter's The Thing in here, which is great. We got Charles Hallahan and Richard Dysart. And here's the fun one. I forgot about this, is that one of the sons of the Conways, the guy who has the gold nugget that gets shot at the end, Jeffrey Weissman. A lot of people don't know him, but he is the guy that they replaced Crispin Glover with in Back to the Future 2. They essentially put George McFly makeup on this guy and had him play George in the sequel because Crispin Glover wouldn't come back because of contract disputes, and ended up getting sued because they essentially had him play that character and using likeness rights and stuff like that. And in a sense, that kind of killed his career afterwards. It's a really interesting story with that guy. But again, like, this is it's a low budget cast, but it's a good cast. And it's very small. It's a very, very small group of people to put in a movie and be able to remain interesting all the way throughout. Okay, so maybe let's talk about tropes now, because I already said the Shane one and the High Plains Drifter one. I think it is interesting that they use the preacher as like the religious allegory coming in, where he essentially represents the horseman of the apocalypse, right? He's death, and death rides a pale horse. He's the pale rider. Megan is reading from the book of Revelation at the very beginning as he's riding into town. So they're setting that up. Okay, it might seem a little bit heavy-handed. It's very spaghetti Western. So when it comes to our writers, they're really reaching deep into the pot of Western trope. And again, I don't hate it. I think it's fine. But I also feel like Eastwood feels so human in the movie that it almost ruins that mystere that they're trying to build. And that's where I'm still not sure yet, is like, is that intentional, or did they just not want to make him too dark? Because they weren't afraid to make him dark as hell in Unforgiven. Like, Clint was good about making that guy dark and evil, like very little redemptive qualities in that guy. Where in this guy, we know he's a gunfighter, we know he's a killer, he comes back as a preacher, and he does have some philosophical things to say to Megan, and he has some philosophical things to say to the people of the town to get them like brave enough to fight for themselves, that they don't need him. But then you kind of lose that cool, mysterious, religious, and supernatural allusion and allegory to it. That's another complaint I kind of have, where it's like, if you're going to find a trope, if you're going to pick a trope, I think you should really push into it a little bit more. You don't have to be too ambiguous, because to me, I wanted more of that mythology. I wanted more of that mysteriousness. And I feel like they just made him way too human in the second act. So the third act, when it comes along and he's a badass, I just wanted more of the darkness. I wanted more of that ambiguity.
Sounds like you wanted more of Rambo in the West there.
No. Because Rambo is PTSD. Rambo is a guy who's fighting because he was screwed over by his country. There's a line that Megan says in that scene where she confesses her love to him, where she also says that she prayed for a miracle and he appeared. So she thinks that he's the miracle. We should have dived a little bit more into that, right? I feel like her quest for resolution gets left unanswered because instead we have to make her the typical female victim at that one point in the movie. And she doesn't really have a chance to recover from that. Her recovery is running into town, and it's too late. He's already gone. And so she has to deliver the obligatory Shane moment, preacher, I love you, we love you. Great line, great ending, but I feel like she didn't get all of her questions answered, and I'm still a little bit loose on that. Like I said, it's a good movie, but I'm picking apart things that I wanted out of it.
Well, and I think that's the point. That's the whole religious aspect of it, because
True.
When we pray, we don't get all the answers. That's what life is. And when we have that one scene between the two of them where, like you said, she states, I asked for a miracle and you appeared, and she uses the word love. And it could, again, 30 years ago at surface level, I would say this is very weird. But looking at the depths of it, is it love of the miracle? Is it love of God? Is it trying to say something more than just the audience assuming that this is a innocent teenage girl saying, I love you for the man that you are. No, she is loving the miracle of it. She's loving the religious aspect. That's the undertone of it. And we, like I said, we kind of get that towards the end where it kind of connects the dots. This is one of those subtle alley-oops to the audience to say, look deeper to what this is saying instead of what it's at surface level. Because if we're going to have this movie, it's either going to be taboo and we're going to go all in, where this is going to be a relationship between an older man and a teenage girl, or you can read between the lines and say, this is the religious aspect of this guy being the redemption. And you're right that he is a little too human. And this could be my analysis of it, is this was a broken man, maybe a little sinful man coming into this, where he actually did come back, and he is not fully a God-fearing man, that he still has some human elements to it, and he still has a little bit of bitterness to it. It's a personal journey for him going through this on adjusting to society, what he's not used to. So I think there are some awkward moments that Eastwood puts into his performance that is really brief. He never has this huge line of dialogue. He's making do with what he knows and what he's been giving when it comes to rebirth, the best way he can. And I love the scene where they're busting that rock, where he says, I love the exercise, put me to work, because that's another little nugget to say he's grateful for the life that he's back to really start to work and use this body that gets a second chance. So to me, there's a lot of elements where I'm glad that he does have a little bit of human element to it, where it's not force feeding it. And it makes me think and almost rewatch it multiple times to see, what did I miss? Because that's what I love about the ending, is the it's you, because that's a hint to me to go back and rewatch the elements that I missed. What other symbolic pieces did I miss during my first viewing?
And I think that's where, again, I'm contradicting myself of saying like, hey, expecting a movie to blow your socks off when you go into it, you're setting yourself up for disappointment. The reason why I want it to be so many things that it's not is because it's so close to so many movies that have already been made that it's obviously pulling from. And one of those movies was one of his movies. It's very, very High Plains Drifter. And it's very, very much Shane. And you just want it to be more like those, at least I do, because otherwise it feels like 3/4 of a novel, right? It feels like there's just something missing to it. And I think that's like the only complaint I really have about the movie, is that it feels incomplete to me because it spends so much time trying to be like other films that already exist that it doesn't do enough to separate itself from those. But that is honestly just picking hairs. But let's talk really fast about like what this does for his career from this point. So this is 1985. He has Pale Rider, then Heartbreak Ridge the next year. So, Vietnam War drama kind of thing. Then he's got the Deadpool, probably the least popular of the Dirty Harry movies, but I like it. I think it's fun. Jim Carrey and Liam Neeson's in it. Almost complete nosedive with Pink Cadillac. White Hunter, Black Heart, and The Rookie are very, very obscure movies of his that a lot of people don't know about. One of them essentially is like a John Huston unofficial biography. And then The Rookie is like a cop movie. And then Unforgiven in 92 just puts him right back on top. So this is the best of his 80s films before he goes into Unforgiven. Not saying that other films are terrible or they're bad in any way. They've got their audiences, but it must have been a challenge for him to realize that this little $7 million movie did so well at the box office and was very critically praised by most critics as like the rebirth of the Western, to have that downward spiral towards the end of the 80s, really giving him the motivation to put everything he had into Unforgiven. And really from then on, he was kind of like on top. Like Eastwood in the 90s is like top tier Eastwood. So it's really cool to kind of go back and see where this lies in his latter day career, where it took him, and then like where he's kind of at now, where both you and I agree that it feels like he's just making movies to make movies now. There's like not a lot of heart in them. And this movie is a lot of heart.
A lot of his early stuff, I got to give him some credit to the point where he's very particular on what projects he's going to take on. You take out especially the ones he's going to be part of or acting in. So when it comes to his acting career, he's had a lot of memorable roles, and you're right. The '90s is where he takes off, and I don't know, Bridges of Madison County is on my top 10 list when it comes to Clint Eastwood movies. But when he goes out of his element to a lot of the non-action movies, a lot of the pushback, that's where we start to get a crescendo of just him not feeling good or not really knowing who he is because he's getting out of his element. He's trying to recognize his age and getting older, but his early stuff when he was young, and I don't want to insult by saying sharp, but he was smarter when it comes to his portrayals in the '90s, when it comes to experimental films that he did. And nowadays, you're right, it's just kind of throwing movies to throw movies at this point. But I do have a respect for the experimental stuff that he tried to do and getting out of his element. I just think it was a little too late for him. I would have loved to see him start earlier when it comes to it.
Well, and this is one of the things I respect about actors that eventually become directors and then really just push hard into being a director. I'd say Robert Redford is another one of those. They make movies because they like movies, right? It's not just a job. It's not just a business. They are so in love with the idea of filmmaking and creating a story. Even if they're not starring in it, they just love the business. They just love the industry and they love making movies. So even if the movie is not that great, you can tell that they put a lot of personal love and passion into the project. But that doesn't mean that the project's going to turn out great. But we've seen so many filmmakers that literally just phone it in, right? Because it's a paycheck for them. And to me, that's the difference between like a true craftsman, which I've always had this like weird division of filmmakers. I think there's the craftsman, like the hardworking filmmaker that, give me a comedy, I'll direct it. Give me an action movie, I'll direct it. Give me a romance, I'll direct it, whatever. You got the auteur, and then you've just got the hack. Brett Ratner's a hack, right? Paul Thomas Anderson is an auteur. Clint Eastwood is a craftsman. He knows the job. He knows the tools. He knows the things that he needs to make a movie and to make a movie that people are going to like or want to watch. And he doesn't make bad movies. He just likes to make movies. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think we need a little bit more of that these days because I think we have too many auteurs and too many hacks.
100%. And there's a level of appreciation for the business at that point. And again, they come old school where, you know what, you had to really work hard, not to saying current talents aren't working hard, but you really had to work hard to get your name known. And there is a certain level of appreciation for old school directors like Eastwood and Redford to really deserve to have their stories told because they are brilliantly directed and it's story first. So I think 100% accurate, 100% right.
Hey, coffee lovers, Antonio and Justin of Back to the Balcony here, and we've got something special for you. If you're looking to start your day with the perfect boost, you need to try Bulletproof Coffee. This isn't your average cup of joe. It's packed with high-quality ingredients designed to fuel your body and mind. Whether you're powering through a workout, tackling a busy workday, or just need the extra edge, Bulletproof Coffee has got you covered. And guess what? We've teamed up with Bulletproof to give you an exclusive deal. Use code B2B, that's B, the number 2B, at checkout to save 20% on your order. That's right, 20% off just for being a loyal listener. So don't wait, head over to Bulletproof's website and experience the difference yourself. Your mornings will never be the same with Bulletproof Coffee. Thank you for listening, and now back to the show. All right, so let's hear what our critics have to say about Pale Rider.
The first Western in 9 years from the biggest movie star in the world, Clint Eastwood. We're going to be very interested in how it does at the box office because it'll help them decide if there's still a market for the Hollywood Western. Well, on the basis of this film, I think the answer is probably yes. Eastwood stars as the Pale Rider, a mysterious man they call the Preacher, who rides into town and decides to help the independent miners in their battle against the local banker and a corrupt marshal. A really original premise for a movie. The film has all the action scenes we expect, but it also has some quieter scenes like this one, where the Preacher has a talk with the daughter of one of the miners.
So we're not going to show that scene, but I wanted to play that initial introduction from Roger because he's 100% right. Like I've said, The plots, the tropes are very familiar, they're recognizable. And the more I think about it, that's a smart thing because we are essentially guiding 80s audiences back into a genre that everyone was saying was dead, right? Heaven's Gate went a little too far. It went a little too auteur. It went a little too art house, and it went way over budget. People hated it. And so it was very difficult to get people excited for the Western again. It's the same thing with Cutthroat Island, man. Like, no one wanted a pirate movie when it came out. And as I think as ambitious and impressive as it was as a spectacle, it doesn't deliver on the story. It doesn't deliver on the final, bravado of what it did with its art design, its set design. But Pirates of the Caribbean, just a few years later, it fixed that, and then it made people want pirate movies again until they made too many. Never-ending circle of pirate movies and cowboy movies that just eventually people get sick of them. But I don't mind it now that I think about it because it really is, okay, he understood we need to get people excited to get back into Westerns again, so let's give them something that's palatable. So I don't hold that as a negative when it comes into terms of the review, even though I kind of hold it as a negative of my overall enjoyment of the movie.
Yeah, and when you have a genre or subgenre and you go more for spectacle versus story or substance, that's when you're going to get into absolute disaster. And we've seen that time and time again when it comes, especially with Cutthroat Island, then Pirates of the Caribbean. Pirates at least had an interesting story. When it comes to what Ebert says, yes, this one did do well in the box office. It did okay in the box office, I should say, for that time, and it did revitalize it. So he was right on that aspect. And this is kind of what I said earlier, where I think Ebert really teeters on is this is what reboots and remake should be, is if you're going to do this and you're going to revitalize it, then you need to have something more of depth. You have something familiar, you have something new, and you have something of substance. So this is what that movie has, and that's the formula to revitalize a genre. And I think this is where it does get it right. And again, Ebert sees that, and when you have that formula going into it with a story that's familiar but newer, you're going to have success. So, and I think he's 100% right.
Pale Rider is not one of those slice-of-life westerns where you get a little bit of everybody going down Main Street knowing each other's business and how they churn butter and so forth. It's a western myth, and it knows it right down to the decision to shoot Eastwood in most of the film with backlighting so you can never quite see his face very clearly, as if he is some kind of supernatural force. This is the 11th movie directed by Clint Eastwood, and he shows a real sense of style, making that little mining camp into a stark, simple place where good folks need somebody like the preacher to stand between them and the forces of evil. This is an exciting action picture, and it's also a Western in the great tradition of Westerns. I liked it.
So he kind of goes to what you say. Like, if you think of this movie as a myth, if you think of it as a legend and lore type thing and not just a slice of life Western, let's say like the John Ford Westerns of the 50s and 60s, right? Where you got to know everybody's business. You got to see all the families. You got to see the Undertaker. You got to see all that stuff. No, this one really does feel like it's almost a ghost town, right? In fact, it seems like this town itself has fled for the hills because it's now owned and operated by LaHood. You know, the big gold magnet of this county is now the person in charge of the town, and then no one wants to live there anymore. They kind of did the same thing in Quick and the Dead with Gene Hackman, where he kind of runs the town. What I like about that one is that they put the town in the middle of nowhere, so people can't really go anywhere. They can't escape the desert. I like that twist on that myth. But this works because the people are out in the hills trying to tin pan gold, and they're trying to get their own wealth. And the main plot point is that LaHood is using technology and industry to use these like hydraulic pumps that shoot water and blast the hills down to collect the gold faster and easier, therefore putting the tin panners essentially out of business. So that is your main conflict. That is your plot point, and it works. It's the perfect way to do it, and it allows you to tell this story with that not many amount of people in the town. Like, it lets you really focus on the two camps. and not all the side characters that we're used to having bogged down a Western like this.
Well, you even take the name Stockburn. I mean, it's closely associated with the dragon or serpent of English culture. So there's a reason that name's inserted when it comes to a deserted town. But what I love about what Ebert points out, and we don't see this enough from their reviews, is the lighting aspect that affects the character. And I love that he inserts that and what it does for the character. He recognizes how that's going to affect how we view this character. It's not so much costume design like the white or black hats, but it's an acknowledgement of what it's trying to do. And I love, love, love the fact that he adds that in, because it does affect the story drastically. So he's, again, one of his better reviews, I'm going to say right now, is he's 100% right. He's getting a lot of the smaller details that's adding to this story.
Well, and so I'm so glad you brought that up, and I'm glad that he says that in his review, because he doubles down on it in Unforgiven, where Gene Hackman is brilliantly lit, but when William Money is in his killer mode, he is backlit, and the shadows are on his face. He knew what he was doing. And we weren't used to seeing that kind of artistic flair from Eastwood in his earlier directorial efforts. They were very, I don't want to say cookie cutter, because that is kind of like a disservice to him, but they were very standard for the industry at the time, right? He was making what was expected to be made and not trying to be too daring with his artistic mentality and his creativity. But in this one, he did allow that mystere to the character. Like, he did allow his cinematographer and his editor and his set designer to be a little bit more dark with it. So if anything, I say this is definitely like the early kind of spawning pool of the ideas that he brought to Unforgiven, which is one of the best Westerns ever made.
Roger, I was disappointed. I thought it was very predictable. You talked about the story being predictable, and a lot of Western stories, it's true, are predictable. Somebody's lost, you got to go get him back. Somebody's wrong, little guy, you got to help him. I expected a little bit more. This film is so reminiscent of a film he made, I think 12 years ago, called High Plains Drifter, the first Western he directed, where he's playing a supernatural force coming in and helping a town, that I was really disappointed. I wanted something more there. The fighting, okay, he can do it very well, and I've seen it a lot. I just had a very flat reaction to the picture. It never got me going.
Okay, so Devil's Advocate, he's not wrong. He's not wrong at all. I just don't feel that way about the movie. I like the movie more than he likes it, but he's not wrong. So if I have to take that stance of like, is he looking at this objectively? And he's not looking at this as a real interesting mythological piece that just happens to be a Western. If he's just going in there and looking at it very statistically and saying, okay, this is plot point A, plot point B, plot point C, we've seen it all before, blah, blah, blah. If he's going into that film with that attitude and that's what he sees, he's not wrong. But I'm going to use the same example that we've used in Fright Night and the same example that we used in other films. He's not getting on the bus for the ride. He's not. Like, he's not letting it take him where the movie wants to take him, where Roger is more than willing to pay the ticket and take the ride. It's one of those reviews, 100%. He is not wrong in his critique, but he's also not allowing the movie to be what it's trying to be for him.
He's not wrong. You're absolutely right. Because if I took my film critic hat off and I had a deadline to watch a movie, go in, knowing I'm only going to have one shot to see this film and I'm going to have to talk about it, I can see what he's seeing. And again, like I said earlier, if it's that one line at the end that gets me to say I need to rewatch and see what I missed. Back then, they didn't have that relevant time to really make that happen. So I get what he's saying. And again, 20 years ago, whatever it may be, I was on the Gene wagon until I understood what the meaning was. And their job isn't to necessarily find the meaning in their video presentation of the review. They're there to present, is it worth the ticket? To me, that's going to be straight down the middle for a lot, because some want to have that in-depth, like I do, explanation or something newer to their genre. Some just want to be entertained. They want to see the shoot, shoot, bang, bang. To me, this gives us a little bit of a subtle mix of both. You don't get the big gun shootouts. I don't find those exciting. I think they were very tense, but I don't find them exciting. And I think when it comes to a successful Western, they don't need to just have a lot of gunfire, a lot of fistfights, a lot of throwing bodies out windows. To me, I think this built the tension. And if I were to look, 15, 20 years ago, I would have at least saw that. I would have saw the tension build. But he obviously, again, was looking for something different. He wanted a Western with a fresh idea, with a fresh villain, something that he hasn't seen before. And I can just tell you right now, in 85, it's nearly impossible to come up with some newer things that you can do in a period piece.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Silverado was a very interesting exception to the rule. But my problem with Silverado, and we've talked about this before, is character fatigue. There's just too many goddamn characters in that movie that you're supposed to invest in and follow along all their different stories. There's way too many characters. We had Legend of the Lone Ranger, Total Bomb. I think it was the Razzie winner of that year. Like, that was supposed to be the film that brought the Western back. Nope, it didn't. So did this film bring the Western back? Not necessarily, but it got people at least interested in the idea that the Western could come back. The Young Guns movies, they're brat pack, just fun little, I don't even call them Westerns, right? They're just action movies that happen to be set in the Old West. But one of the things that he says that I just can't dismiss is that he doesn't say he doesn't like the movie. He just says that he was disappointed in it. There's nothing wrong with that. It did not meet his expectations. And even though he did give it a thumbs down, I don't think it's a thumbs down out of dislike. It's a thumbs down as of, I wanted more and this movie didn't give it to me. That's a very hard place for this guy as a critic. And it's a very interesting dynamic for these two and how they operate their show, because they are both such different critics and they have such different priorities in what is important to them in their cinema, that's what made that show so interesting. It wasn't two people of the same mind making the same decision, the same opinion of a movie. Every week they came at each movie with a different expectation and a different point of view, and sometimes they would contradict each other, and that's totally fine. There were some movies that they just did not like. Okay, they didn't like it. He was just disappointed by this one because he likes the genre, he likes the actor, he likes the director. He was just expecting something more and maybe something different, and it was just a little too familiar to the things that he'd seen in the past for him to get past that. It's just an homage to movies that have been made before.
And one thing, just before we get into the next one, is we kind of forget with these two that these two are seeing just about every single movie known to man after their youth, which they already love movies. So they have seen all these Westerns, and they really want to be, it's like their Christmas wish to have and be surprised with a new freshness to the genre. So the disappointment will always be present in a review.
There's a scene with the mother of the girl, Carrie Snodgrass. It's sort of inexplicable, a love scene where he takes tremendous sympathy on her. I agree with you that the scene with the girl is probably the most interesting scene with the film. You sort of hold your breath there. Yeah. At least there they've come off the norm and they're discussing something that's a little bit strange and different. But otherwise, I didn't think there was anything just but routine stuff.
I'll even defend the scene with Carrie Snodgrass. I think what's going on there, and which is handled very subtly throughout the film, is the idea that he may have met her before. Mm-hmm. Just as he may have met the Marshal before, and the Marshal may
that's for sure.
have shot him before.
That's for sure.
And the way it's handled in the movie, I thought, was very interesting and very intelligent, almost the way it would be handled in a samurai movie, a good one from Japan, where this level of existence and other levels of existence are kind of there, and yet nobody quite says so. Like the Marshal doesn't say, "You're the guy I killed 6 years ago."
Yes, but we have clues very visual.
I found that intriguing. I also found the visual look of the movie very, very interesting, so I did like it. And,
well, nothing special for me, and I think that the jury's still out on whether the Western is going to come back.
Of course, he has the negative Nancy at the end. So there's a very interesting thing that Roger brings up, and that is, what does the preacher actually represent when it comes to his interaction with the characters? So Stockburn obviously knows him from the past. They're both killers. They're both gunslingers from the past. I don't think that Carrie Snodgrass's character knew him from the past. I think he represents to her the kind of man that she wished she could get, but is not the right man for her at this point in her life. The right man for her is the Michael Moriarty character. And that's a brilliant scene that I think is actually maybe a little too underplayed. And it's a little too close to the Megan scene. I think there should have been a little bit more gap in between those two, because for Megan, it's hope, it's the answer to a miracle, and it's also the fact that this is a person that wants to protect her and protect her family when she's been raised in this mining community where these men are essentially all cowards. So that's what he represents to her. To Carrie Snodgrass's character, he represents the man that she wished she had 15 years ago, not the husband that ran away and left her a single mom, right? So Roger's right. There are a lot of different aspects of his character that mean different things to the different characters in this movie. But the movie's not about that. It's up to the audience to catch it and recognize it. And I don't think Gene recognized it. I think he sat in that theater eating his goobers, waiting for the moments that he wanted to see, and he didn't appreciate the moments that were given to us.
Yeah, I mean, 100%, because he even, when Roger starts to list all these hints and he's acknowledging it, he's saying, yes, you're right. Yeah, I get that. And then he goes, but there's nothing interesting about it. To me, that is something interesting about it, because it makes for some critical thinking. It makes it so you're doing the work on a story that's already been seen and already present. So that's what's so irritating, when we get acknowledgement when he's listing off all these unique things when it comes to the dialogue and the storytelling. And then it just says, nah, it's not unique. It is 100% unique, because it's like when you point out all these clues, we can go and have a full other episode on going in depth on these characters. And if it gets to that extent, then it is an interesting movie. It is something that you can really spend time with. But honestly, if you want it spoon-fed to you and you want a silly Western, then that's what you went in expecting. You're not going to like this movie, because it does require some thinking if you are to enjoy it.
Yeah, and that is why I will gladly say the things that I wanted to see more of in the movie. But that doesn't keep me from saying that it is not a good movie. It's a really, really good movie. I just wanted more out of it. Me not getting what I want is totally different than me saying this movie sucks because it didn't give me what I want. If anything, it makes me like the movie more, because now I have more investment in it, right? Like, I can now be a part of the film, which is the whole point of a film. It's the whole point of reading a book. What's the point of watching a movie or reading a book if you are not emotionally allowing yourself to be vulnerable and place yourself in these characters' fears and desires and their wants and their despairs? Like, that's the whole point. Like, being emotionally connected to a movie is the first step of having it be a good movie. And I was emotionally connected the whole way through. So emotionally connected, in fact, that I wanted more. And that's fine. The fact that I didn't get more doesn't mean that it didn't do a good job. It meant that it did a great job, and it made me want more of it.
I can 100% see that, because we can say that about a lot of the movies that we just really want more of. And I can even say that about this movie that I wanted more of. But at the same time, with me personally, if it would have given me more, I don't know if me personally, my interpretation of it, I would have liked it. Because I went into it expecting another Western, because when I went into my Western kick after seeing High Noon, there are so many Westerns that it was just so repetitive over and over again of the same stuff. And this is the one that actually did take me by surprise, because I was actively looking for something to take me by surprise, like High Noon did.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. Okay, so when it comes down to the final review, the final critique of what our critics said, this is a hard one for me, because do I agree with Gene? Emotionally, no. I don't agree with him emotionally, because I like the film. But logically and on paper, he's not wrong. So I can't give him too much hate. I'm going to give him a B-, because it did not give him what he wanted from this film. But he also did not dislike the film, and he didn't destroy it, and he didn't bury it. He had complimentary things to say about it. I just think that he didn't give enough of his opinions on the stuff that worked. Instead, he just talked about the things that he thought it lacked. But he didn't say he didn't dislike it. He was just disappointed. So I'm going to give the optimist in him a B minus.
I think that's fair. When it comes to Ebert, he takes all the right aspects of this movie, from the technical aspects to the storytelling to the symbolism. This is where he loses some points, because going into it, my first reaction is give this man 3.5, 4 stars on it, because he hits every single point. But this is where I think it loses a little bit for me, is he gives away too much. Especially for somebody that's going into the movie that wants to discover this for the first time themselves, setting the expectation of what they're going to see without giving plot point of course he knew him in a previous life, he shot him. I think it's too much. And the second aspect of it is he doesn't go up to bat for a movie he obviously has a passion around, and he obviously knows more of what he saw versus Gene. So on those two aspects of it, I would have to go with a solid 3 stars on it, because I think he nails everything, but he misses two main elements that to me is a big no-no when it comes to film criticism.
So this is something that I don't think we've really talked about before in the 26, 27 episodes that we've done. It's almost as if Gene is a better critic and Roger is a better essayist. Like, Roger really wants to dive into the meaning of the movie, the plot of the movie, the structure of the movie. He wants to deconstruct, where Gene really just plays it at face value. Now, this is apples and oranges, whether or not that's what you want out of a critic, or do you want an essayist who's going to take the time to really dive into it and maybe divulge a little too much about the movie in his review. If you read his actual Sun-Times reviews, he spoils everything. Like, he really dives into the essay-like qualities of his writing and what he thinks these movies mean. But these are supposed to be reviews. These are supposed to be critiques to motivate people or dissuade people from spending their $5, $6, $7, however much a ticket cost back then. Where I feel Gene is like that general practitioner who just comes in and says, you got cancer, and then leaves, right? He really just delivers the message and then GTFO. I feel Roger wants to debate more. I feel Roger wants to deconstruct more. And that's the big question, does that make a better critic, or does that make a better film analyst? Because if you read his books, he's a great analyst. And sometimes it makes me wonder if that makes him a better critic, or maybe sometimes it loses his objectivity of what a critic's supposed to do.
Roger's a fantastic writer, and Gene, you're 100% right on that analysis. But here's the thing on where I would go on the defense on it is what Roger, when he goes into detail, and it's a level of passion, it's a level of excitement for seeing something good.
Yeah.
If we compare it to a horrible movie, he wants that review done with as soon as possible. It's that magic you feel when you get excited about something. And I can relate to that when I see finally a good movie after some shitty movies that come out. But it's one of those that you really want to find that best friend and just talk about this movie for a half hour. And the child in me, looking back to my past of reading his reviews and watching the video interviews, is that built excitement for me to want to look for the things that he wanted to look for. But to an extent, when it comes to a video interview, or a video review, that's where I would limit it a little bit to just say it's a thumbs up or thumbs down and relate it to how you're going to rate a movie. So in a written review, we have the benefit of skimping a couple things if it goes too deep, but in a video review, we don't. So to me, I think there's two formats these two have. Utilize them well, and I can appreciate the excitement, but in the video interview, I think at that point, we need to limit the analysis. That's for the written words to really shine.
The best episodes are always the one where there's discourse between the two, not the pulpit where they can essentially bring their analysis of the film onto the screen, because that's when they just divulge way too much about the story and the plot, and then we lose that opportunity of having great discourse of why they liked it or they didn't. And we're going to get into some episodes in the future where they had, like, we haven't even touched the big ones. Like, we haven't touched the Full Metal Jacket Benji conversation yet. We haven't touched the big ones yet, and they're coming, but this is a really interesting episode for that conversation of like, yeah, who's the better critic, but who's the better writer? And I think over time, we'll start having more conversations about that topic.
I was going to say, if you really want to debate about that, you have Gene's review of Friday the 13th, where he gives away the entire ending on purpose.
Which is coming up. It's on the list. I think it'll probably hit in October, which is perfect timing. So awesome, man. Well, I got to say, like, I'm glad I brought this movie to the list because it was one that's just been sitting on the shelf, dusty, haven't touched it in 20 years. It was my dad's. And I've been so critical about Clint Eastwood and his filmmaking of the last 10, 15 years that I really wanted to go back and dive into his catalog of films that I remembered seeing, but couldn't tell you if I liked them or not. And this one really, really surprised me. So I'm glad that we were able to do this episode and really dive into it.
I'm glad you brought it to the table. It's been years since I rewatched it, and honestly, it's, to me, just as special when I first watched it.
Awesome. Okay, so next week, we're bringing you one of our very special bonus episodes. We are going to tackle the episode that is covering the 1980s guilty pleasures of Gene and Roger. It was 1989. They were closing out the decade, and they wanted to talk about their guilty pleasure films of that decade. There's a lot of fun movies on there, and it's really interesting to see which critic picked which film as their guilty pleasure and which film the other critic absolutely hated. It's a fun episode, and I can't wait for this conversation, although I feel we're going to be very, I don't know, even keel on a lot of the choices. There's a few wild cards in there that I don't know your opinion on, and I don't want to know until we talk about it.
I think I gave away my first reaction to the first movie, and you know what? I'm excited just based on that conversation. So it's going to be a fantastic episode.
Can't wait. So everyone, please like, review, rate, share, subscribe to Back to the Balcony on your favorite podcatcher and on YouTube. You can find me, my show, The Cultworthy, at thecultworthy.com. You can find Justin and his show at
themoviewire.com.
And like we always say, if you've got any suggestions for us of films to cover that Siskel and Ebert did on their show, let us know. We would be more than happy to tackle them. And we are starting to accept guests now. So we've got some guests coming up in the near future. We have a guest joining us in a Star Trek episode, and we have a guest joining us on the infamous Pulp Fiction Quentin Tarantino episode from 1994. So stay tuned for that. If you're a film podcaster or a writer or someone who's fascinated about movies, reach out to us. You might end up on the show.